Well, hello and welcome everybody to the Preparing for Regulatory Change session. My name is Jeff Reed and I am a GRC analyst and solutions engineer at Onspring. And what Onspring is, it's an intelligent automation software. And I like to think of it as a business process automation tool that's going to help organizations with reporting needs, communication strategies, access control, workflow capabilities. But it's an intelligent automation platform. Prior to joining Onspring, I worked in a consultative role, specializing in a variety of industries, but also the financial services industries. And really my goal was to help businesses identify where, as well as how they can strengthen their risk management efforts, including governance as well as compliance from any angle, cyber, financial, operational, as well as spanning multiple different types of regulations. When I joined Onspring, my role started to shift a little bit, and now I spend a majority of my time focusing on putting my recommendations as well as best practices that I've learned throughout my consultation days and helping build governance, risk, and compliance programs using technology to help banks like yourselves become more efficient and nimble. Also joining us today, we have Viviana, and Viviana is a senior security and compliance engineer at Jack Henry & Associates. So Viviana, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you all for being here. Welcome to our session today. Viviana Campanaro, Senior Security and Compliance Engineer at Jack Henry, where I've been working with financial institutions on their information security and risk management programs over the last 4.5 years or so. Prior to joining Jack Henry, I worked as an information security practitioner at both a large bank and a healthcare insurance company in the Northeast for the better part of 20 years, doing risk assessments, policy development, vendor assessment, security awareness education to employees and executive management. So I've walked the walk and I've lived what it is like to be in a regulated industry. And during my time, I've seen some common pitfalls and challenges that compliance teams navigate. So I'm very excited to join Jeff in our conversation today, looking at real examples to show you how you can effectively navigate around those pitfalls and challenges to create these compliance programs that are adaptable, proactive, and more importantly, relevant to your financial institutions. So very happy to be here.
All right, thanks, Viviana. Let's go ahead and dive in. So preparing for regulatory change. We're going to start today by outlining what we see as two big hiccups in terms of managing regulatory compliance. And we're going to focus our conversation today around number one, maintaining updates on compliance changes and talking about, and Viviana is going to share some awesome examples about how we can use communication to help us maintain those updates of those ever going and ever changing regulatory compliance changes. Also, number two, we're going to be focusing on identifying and actioning and understanding what are the impacts of those changes. So a lot of good stuff to cover throughout our session today. We all know that monitoring for regulatory changes can definitely become time consuming. It can quickly become a burden to your organization. But with that being said, we still understand that it's going to be very critical for us to ensure that all of our primary as well as any of our sub business processes continue to operate effectively, but still continue to maintain compliance to any newly added regulations, as well as any existing regulation requirements that are going to be updated. But once a regulatory change becomes applicable to your organization, we really have to take a step back here and ask ourselves a couple questions. It's important for us to understand, what is going to be impacted by this change? And so, asking ourselves the question, is it going to be the policies that we have in place? Or is it going to be a set of controls or audit objectives that we have in place? Or is it going to span into our business processes that need to be reviewed and updated? So, being able to gain an understanding of all these impacted areas can very quickly turn into a complex puzzle that we need to solve. And so we're going to share some examples from what we've experienced over time, but also we're going to start sharing some examples of how you can use technology to help make solving that puzzle a little bit easier. So Viviana, you and I were talking earlier this week, and as we were prepping for this, and you shared a couple really good examples of, from a baking experience of what this actually looks like. So I was hoping maybe you would feel comfortable sharing some of those examples with us.
Absolutely. Yes. And this is a conversation that is pretty much our bread and butter in my present role and in my career as an information security practitioner, because we did have those struggles. Having worked in a financial institution specifically, keeping up with the regulatory changes and all of the expectations that came with that, and reconciling them with manual processes that we had at our financial institutions. And in my role today, we still see banks struggle with those manual processes and spreadsheets, particularly where regulatory changes are concerned. And several come to mind, relative to cybersecurity. I think that's the biggest one that's come out since the cybersecurity assessment tool came out in 2015. The business continuity management change from the FFIEC that came out was another example. And thinking back to those, the cybersecurity assessment tool announcement from the FFIEC created a lot of challenges, but also opportunities for the compliance departments to work with the risk departments, and often where financial institutions have individuals that wear both hats, compliance officers / risk officers. It became an opportunity to really look at those processes. But unfortunately, we still had spreadsheets, and we still see spreadsheets that track this. So they're very powerful, and I don't discount Excel for what it does, but we see so many examples of financial institutions that have their risk assessment processes in spreadsheets with these complex formulas and macros and things that do a very, very good job. But then, at the same time, there's a vendor management department that's tracking vendor spend and vendor contracts and vendor due diligence reviews in yet another spreadsheet. And then the business continuity planning group is planning the progress of their plan maintenance in yet another spreadsheet. And come board reporting time, the struggle to put together those reports becomes a mad dash to the finish line to consolidate these spreadsheets into visuals that make sense for a board report. So it's a lot of manual interaction, a lot of processing, and sometimes we lose sight of the bigger picture, which is, how is compliance impacting us? How is the regulatory change impacting our business processes at the bank? And how are we staying ahead of that in a way that's more effective? So, that is part of the challenge. And so, the way to tackle that has become, and over time, I've seen this kind of, function in this manner, kind of a threefold way of tackling that. So when it comes to regulatory changes, there are several options that banks can consider to intake those regulatory changes and have a consistent and reliable way of notifying themselves and their appropriate individuals within and external dependencies in the financial institution of the impacts of those regulatory changes can have. And there are entities out there, for the financial industry specifically, the FFIEC does have what we call those RSS feeds, the really simple syndication feeds. And those are essentially XML or web pages that share information over the internet. Nowadays, everybody has a website. The federal organizations all have websites, and many of them, if not all of them, have RSS feeds that can be incorporated into your technology solutions to integrate with your notification systems. Unfortunately, that option tends to be very, very expensive. Sometimes it's very cumbersome to maintain feeds like that. And especially from a cybersecurity perspective, there might be some concerns with web spoofing, and other risks that impact the cybersecurity aspect of RSS feeds. However, it is an option that many large institutions have embraced and use very successfully today. The second option is monitoring services. So services that collate and automatically identify those regulatory changes that are relevant to a financial institution based on the products and services that they offer, and bake them into a solution or into an infrastructure environment that is secure and reliable. So those types of feeds are often by third-party providers that have subscription services that banks can utilize to select which compliance programs apply to them based on their practices. So, some banks may be deposit and savings only, other banks may be lending or insurance, other banks may be card issuers. And so different regulations apply for those products and services, and those subscriptions can be added into a feed that integrates with the internal processes of the institution. And then, the last option is the managed services. And here's where you have the baked in professional expertise along with a subscription service that automatically incorporates those regulatory changes that impact your specific financial institution and create those workflows that then, get proliferated down. An example of this that came to mind as I was thinking through our conversations preparing for this today is the Dodd-Frank Act. So thinking back to the Great Recession of 2008, and the subsequent passing of the Dodd-Frank Act, those of you bankers out there are probably going to be very familiar, particularly those who have lending practices and mortgage lending processes. That required banks to address their liquidity risks very quickly. It required an implementation of new lending practices because there was a lot of expectation from the compliance side for banks to provide evidence of Fair Lending Act and consumer protection practices. So there was a lot of downstream impact to the finance department, to the accounting department, to the lending department, and also to IT departments who in many cases had to upgrade their loan origination systems to reflect those new requirements under the law. So, those types of activities came about in unfortunately, in some cases, very manual ways where compliance officers were sent a notification from the federal government saying this has to be enacted, and subsequent meetings took place. They had to batten down the hatches to begin the process of identifying what areas needed to change and how those areas needed to change. So compliance officers, risk officers, information security officers, CFOs, and CIOs had to come together very quickly and figure out a way to start with the compliance and let's not forget internal audit and the CPAs that came across to then figure out if we are in compliance with this very important law that was passed at the time. Got very busy very quickly. But after the worst was over, and this was something that I was aware of, happened. It was after my tenure in the banks, but something that was very real and present because as a mortgage, holder myself, there were a lot of changes that we were made aware of from our financial institution that was carrying our mortgage. A lot of change, and so on the financial institution side, the stories that came back to me since I've been doing this at Jack Henry was, how do we do this better next time? How do we prepare for the eventuality that a regulatory change is going to cause the mess of changes that we've just have to go through? And here's where solving part 2 comes into play.
All right. Thanks, Viviana. So part 2, now we're going to start thinking about, okay, using that notification system, how are we going to be able to start building actions from that notification system? So solving number 2 is about adapting your data collection, being able to adapt reporting needs so we have visibility into these changes, adapting our notification as well as our communication strategies to make sure that we're proactively addressing the actions that must come after a regulatory change has been announced. So if we think about the life cycle here, what does a regulatory change life cycle look like? It really begins with that regulatory change being announced, which Viviana covered in part 1. Now, once we understand that there's a new change announced, it really falls into what are the different breakdowns that we need to look at in terms of taking care of this change. And one, it really falls within an analysis phase to begin with, we need to be able to analyze the details of that change. Once we want to be able to communicate it about the change, but also once that change is in place, we need to be able to go in and review all of the details that make up that individual change. Once we've analyzed the change, now it moves into more of assessment mode. Being able to conduct impact assessments against your current processes. Now we need to start gaining visibility into all of the potential impacted areas, whether they're the policies, the controls, the risks, the objectives, whatever it may be. We need to start trying to identify, what's impacted. And this may not just be for one business unit. This can definitely span multiple business units, multiple entities, as well as departments. So that one change to that regulation can definitely have a downstream impact to multiple areas. After completing that assessment and getting some visibility into the impacted areas, now we need to start communicating out to owners, the different policy owners, the control owners, and we need to start communicating to them and allowing them to start making some suggestions as well as recommendations of, now that we understand the change, well, now how are we going to start updating our current processes to satisfy that change? And this is likely going to require multiple stakeholders amongst multiple departments, and there's likely going to be levels of workflow involved. After the change has been suggested of, hey, this is how we need to make sure that we're updating our policies. These are the different procedures that we need to either add or update our existing procedures to satisfy that change, but making sure that they're properly getting reviewed by multiple stakeholders before we sign off on that. Now, from an implementation standpoint, once those suggestions and recommendations are made, let's go ahead and implement those changes to make sure that they continue to meet the compliance needs. So that's a lot going on. That's a really big life cycle. And if you have, if you're tracking this today in siloed systems, if you're tracking it today in Excel spreadsheets, sometimes it's hard to gain that visibility of all these data connections and interrelationships that are going to take place. So if we think about this process, this life cycle we just talked through, and we take that process and start utilizing technology, that's going to greatly improve and start to incorporate real-time actions instead of those manual actions. Now we have some real-time actions that are taking place, and we're starting to use automation from the technology to send out those notifications, to drive workflow processes, to be able to keep track of the different reviews and the comments that are taking place related to those suggestions. So over the next couple slides here, I want to share just a couple examples of what this could potentially look like using a technology. And so this first visual here is a dashboard with a list of reports. In my mind, reports are always very, very valuable because as we're loading information, content into a technology, and if we're using from part one, a notification system using RSS feeds, a monitoring service, whatever it may be, as we're pulling information into a technology, it's important to be able to start visualizing the status of the data. And so as we have open regulatory change reviews, we're going to want to understand, well, how many open change reviews do we have? And from an open status, that may mean, hey, it's been open, but it hasn't been assigned yet to anybody for review, or it has been assigned and it's going through that review process. Maybe it's in the policy owner's queue of making sure that they're getting their policies updated. But also from a reporting structure, we are now able to start filtering that data down to be able to start categorizing it by different agencies related to the types of changes that are coming into place. So how many open change reviews do we have related to the FDIC? But also from a regulation standpoint, you can use technology to start flagging, well, which regulations are mission critical to us as an organization or as an individual business unit. So now we can start using reporting to quickly identify, well, here are our mission critical regulations that we need to comply with. And we want to be alerted or notified right away if any changes are made to those critical ones, as well as any ones. Now, as we think about reporting, it then can start going a level deeper. And as we click in here, we are understanding the regulation guidelines, but it's also important to use technology to understand, well, what are the impacted areas? So Viviana, as you look at this list here and start, reading some of these guideline names, I was curious if you had any examples that you could talk us through, just relating to, hey, this is a guideline and how this could be a downstream impact to other areas.
Oh, certainly. And some of these, keeping in mind they are examples, they are CFR statements that actually come out. So, think about, the FDA issued a CFR that required privacy notices sent to consumers. Well, what does the Consumer Protection Act require those privacy notices in addition to other notices that were required for the lending process specifically? You can look through all of the impacted policies that, as a result, need to be enacted. So when you're thinking to your lending process or your account opening process, where privacy notices are usually sent to consumers, how do those processes take place? Often we see those in an automated fashion, where an email is issued to a member or a customer, with the privacy notice or with, the disclosure notices in the lending process, et cetera. And what that means is that there are internal policies at the bank at play that regulate how those notifications are sent. And in this case, we see that relative to that regulatory change, there are some impact system that generates that notification. So countless out there, privacy notices are a feature benefit component of those. Those notices usually get sent via email, and those emails usually traverse a firewall. And those firewalls have rules that require certain configuration setting. And so that's where the policy drives that configuration setting that enables that notification to be sent out to the consumer, thereby complying with the regulation. That in turns turns into controls, and controls are the audit item, right? So the policy drives the practice, the control drives the audit item. So when you're thinking about firewall and network traffic, you're thinking about that privacy notice traversing your firewall and traversing your system and getting to the consumer in a safe and consistent manner. So there's an integrity factor at play there. And so those types of controls are, the subject of the audit and the focus of the audit. So, you start with the regulatory driver that says that you need to establish a practice. You then look at the downstream impact of that practice, which means that you may have to implement, enhance, or enact a policy for network configuration and security. And then that translates into a set of controls that are automatically being implemented and enforced in an auditable process. So those finance and accounting processes that depend on that particular notification are also accounted for in that regulatory change. So now you have a better picture of all of the downstream impacts that regulatory change had. And I think that's kind of the example that I can think of to reconcile what we're seeing here and how effective it is to be able to take those feeds from the regulatory bodies and translate them into processes that make sense to you, that are very applicable to your size complexity products and services that you're offering your customers.
That's fantastic, Vivian. And as we look at these visuals here, the way that the technology can work is, using those feeds to pull in the information, but also really bringing everything into a centralized location. I'm thinking of this as an ecosystem for all of our processes, being able to store all of our policies, our controls, our processes, our risks, whatever it may be, our applications, our assets, in a centralized tool. And with it in a centralized tool, that allows us to start creating relationships amongst the data. So within the regulatory record itself, I would be able to say, here are the policies that are tied to this regulation. Here are the controls and processes that are mapped to that regulation. So now if we think back to part one, using the communication system, a new change comes into the platform. Now I can use automation within the technology. I can have the system identify, well, something's been modified to this regulation. Therefore, I want the system to create a regulatory change review. And when that regulatory change review is created, I want to automatically use the technology to pull in the policies, the controls, the processes, the risks, the objectives that are directly tied to that regulation. So now we're making the puzzle less complex because we're using the technology to help automate, but also gather the impacted areas and putting it into a centralized location for us.
Mhm.
With the next slide here, communication and that strategy of communicating is very important as well. So once we understand the impacted areas, let's send out an email to the impacted policy owners and the control owners and whoever's impacted by this change. Let's use automated communication from a technology to notify them. Now they're understanding, well, okay, this guideline looks familiar to me, and I know I have a policy that's written to satisfy it and controls that are written to satisfy it. So now I'm understanding that, well, this change is impacting me. And so I need to go ahead and click into the technology and start familiarizing myself with that particular guideline, understanding what's new or what's changed with this guideline, but also going into my related process that I own, the controls that I own, and making sure that I'm updating those effectively, making sure that I'm getting proper review and approval by all different stakeholders as we're implementing those changes within the system. So this is just a visual of using technology as we pull data and content into a technology system like we're showing here. It's going to need a place to live, and we're using fields to store that information within the platform, and then using automation from the system to notify and auto create records based off any type of regulatory change reviews that need to occur.
This is great. I love it. And so similar to that notification that we saw very specifically to the privacy notice, there are also other examples that we can apply to this process. And one that also comes to mind is the one where the FFIEC announced the change in their business continuity planning guidelines to be business continuity management. Business continuity is something that applies across the board pretty much in every financial institution. So, to have a regulatory change of that magnitude really meant that institutions have to go from, shelving plans once a year, the disaster recovery business continuity plans, that exercise that happens once a year, you put it in a binder and forget it. Now they're required to have an ongoing process of managing those business continuity plans, testing them on a regular basis, and ensuring that they work. That when an incident or a disaster happens, you have those plans ready to go, and those plans are effective and updated. Your contact information is up to speed. So, that regulatory change can be translated into a similar process like this, where now business continuity policies needed to change. The business continuity policy that said that you have to, on an annual basis, update your plans now became a policy statement that says that you have to do it monthly. And every department is on a cycle where on a monthly basis, each department gets to update their plans and declare that they've updated them. So the compliance aspect of it comes in when a solution like this has that visibility and downstream communication to notify the stakeholders that a regulatory change has taken place that's impacting these policies. And oh, by the way, these processes now need to change or be reflected in a more frequent basis. So you have the business continuity, regulation that comes out. You have the compliance aspect of it at play. You have the policy change that's impacted or enacted in a way that is present and in front of you through that communication channel. The controls that are associated with those policy changes, meaning business continuity plans that are tested. Testing a plan is a control. Any third parties that are involved in a disaster recovery or backup capacity. So often business continuity plans include a data backup functionality that depends on a third party. Those third parties in turn need to be brought into the fold to make sure that they're up to speed with their role in a recovery scenario where data has to be made available during a business continuity event. And then, of course, any incidents that have to, enact a plan. What is the incident response plan specifically to enact a business continuity plan? So all of those, all of those functions are now working together when you have the visibility and the automation to make that communication effective and transparent across the financial institution. So pretty cool stuff.
It is, yeah, and using technology to connect all the dots, right? Because everything is interrelated with one another. It definitely can be. So that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we thank everybody for taking time and allowing Viviana and myself to walk you guys through the regulatory change process and helping prepare for that process. On this slide here is our contact information. Feel free to write down our email addresses. And if you guys have any questions after the fact, definitely feel free to reach out to Viviana or myself at any time. We'd be more than happy to have a meeting with you to get those questions answered and go forth with from there. So we hope this has been beneficial for you guys and helpful. We've greatly enjoyed presenting to you, and we hope that you guys enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.